Carys's fingers were still red from the dishwater at the diner when Gavin slid the document across the mahogany desk. He didn't notice the way her wedding ring, the cheap silver band they'd bought in a pawn shop 5 years ago, was sliding off her finger because she'd lost so much weight skipping meals to pay his office rent. He didn't notice the exhaustion in her eyes, or the fact that she was wearing the same coat she'd bought at a thrift store so he could have the suit he was wearing right now. He just looked at her as if she were a smudge on his window to the future. "I've outgrown this life, Carys," he said, his voice as clinical as a balance sheet. "And honestly, I've outgrown you." He signed his name with a flourish, and not realizing that the very company he was so proud of had just been purchased by a man who spent his weekends teaching Carys how to fix old clocks in a dusty garage. Welcome to the channel. Today, we're diving into a story about why you should never mistake a person's silence for a lack of power. Before we begin, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been made to feel like you weren't enough for someone you gave everything to? The diner was called the Copper Spoon, and it smelled like burnt coffee and yesterday's bacon grease from the moment you walked through the door at 5:45 in the morning until the last booth was wiped down at midnight. Silas Thorne, well, Gavin Aldridge now, though lately she'd been wondering why she ever changed her name, knew every inch of that smell. It lived in her hair. It settled into the fabric of her uniform, the one with the small tear at the left pocket she kept meaning to sew shut and never did, because by the time she got home at night, her hands were too tired to hold a needle steady. She was 31 years old, and she moved through that diner like someone twice that age. It wasn't always this way. There was a version of Carys, not so long ago really, who laughed easily, who had a habit of humming while she cooked, who once drove 4 hours on a whim, just to see a sunset over the coast with her college roommate. That Carys had dreams that didn't fit inside the floor plan of a small apartment with a leaky faucet in the bathroom and a landlord who only returned calls about late rent. That Carys had also believed deeply and completely that Gavin Aldridge was worth building a life around. She still remembered the night he told her about his idea. They were sitting on the fire escape of their first apartment, sharing a bottle of wine they couldn't afford, and Gavin had this wild light in his eyes, the kind that made him look young and hungry and electric all at once. He said he wanted to build a consulting firm. Strategic Acquisition Advisory, he called it, which was a fancy way of saying he wanted to help rich companies buy other companies and take a percentage for brokering the connection. He had the vision, he said. He just needed time and money, and someone who believed in him. Carys had said yes to all three without even being asked directly. She picked up the extra shifts at the Copper Spoon. She deferred her own enrollment in the graphic design program she'd saved up for. When his car needed a new transmission, hers got sold. When his office needed furniture that didn't look like it came from a college dorm room, she found second-hand pieces and refinished them by hand in the parking lot of their building on her one day off. She told herself this was what partnership looked like. She told herself that the ground they were building was solid, and that once Gavin got his footing, once the business took off, it would all circle back. People will tell you that love makes you blind. What they don't say is that exhaustion does something even more insidious. When you're tired enough, you stop noticing the warning signs, not because you can't see them, but because you can't afford the emotional energy to deal with them. Carys noticed plenty. She noticed when Gavin stopped asking how her day went. She noticed when the way he looked at her changed, not into something cold, not at first, but into something indifferent, the way you stop really seeing a piece of furniture that's always in the same corner. She noticed when he started spending nights at the office and coming home with a new sharpness about him, a kind of impatience with the smallness of their life that he didn't bother to fully hide anymore. She noticed. She just kept moving. On Saturday mornings, though, she had a ritual. Every Saturday, unless she was pulling a double, Carys drove to the east side of town, where the streets got quieter and the storefronts got older, and she walked through the door of a shop with a hand-painted wooden sign that read Thorne and Sons, Watch Repair and Restoration. The bell above the door made a sound like a single soft note on a xylophone, and the smell inside was nothing like the diner. It smelled like machine oil and cedar, and something else she could never quite name. Something warm and deliberate, like time itself had slowed down and agreed to stay a while. Her father, Silas Thorne, would already be at the bench. He was a compact man with silver hair and reading glasses that perpetually sat at the very end of his nose, and he had the hands of someone who had spent decades doing precise, careful work. He could hold a movement no bigger than a thumbnail between two fingers and tell you its entire history, who made it, what year, what was wrong, what it needed. He talked to watches the way some people talk to plants, with patience, with the genuine assumption that they were worth saving. Carys had grown up in this shop. When she was small, she used to sit on a stool in the corner and do her homework while Silas worked. The two of them comfortable in the kind of quiet that only exists between people who really know each other. Her mother had died when Carys was 9, and after that, it was just the two of them, and the shop, and the clocks on every wall that her father wound by hand every Sunday evening like a private ceremony. She never fully understood why a man this meticulous, this careful, lived so modestly. The shop was in a neighborhood that had seen better decades. The apartment above it, where Silas still lived, had mismatched furniture and a kitchen with appliances that dated to the early 90s. He drove a truck that was old enough to vote. He shopped at the discount grocery 2 blocks over, and he clipped coupons, actual paper coupons, which he kept in a little accordion folder by the door. When she was younger, Carys assumed they were poor. Not desperately so, but the comfortable kind of modest, where you didn't go hungry, but you also didn't dream too big. She'd carried that assumption into adulthood without ever really questioning it. The way you carry a lot of things your parents teach you without realizing they're teaching you anything at all. Silas never corrected her. That was important, though she wouldn't understand why until much later. What he did do, every Saturday, was teach her things, not lectures. Silas wasn't a lecture kind of man, more like demonstrations. He'd hand her a broken pocket watch and say, "Tell me what's wrong with it," and then sit back and wait while she fumbled through it, making mistakes, asking questions, learning by the particular kind of doing that leaves real knowledge in your hands rather than just your head. She could now disassemble and reassemble 6 different types of mechanical movements. She knew how to identify a cracked mainspring by sound alone. She knew that the most common reason a beautiful, expensive watch stops working isn't catastrophic failure. It's just neglect. Small, accumulated neglect over a long time until the mechanism can't compensate anymore. She thought about that sometimes. In her marriage, the Saturday before Gavin handed her the divorce papers, she'd driven to the shop and found Silas at his bench, working on an antique repeater. A complicated thing, the kind that chimes the hours, and he'd looked up at her over his glasses with the specific expression she'd learned to recognize as him reading her the way he read watches. "You look tired," he said. "I'm always tired," she said, which was true, and they both knew she wasn't just talking about the diner. He didn't push. He just moved over on the bench and made room for her, and handed her a loop and a small brass carriage clock that needed its escapement adjusted. And they worked side by side for 2 hours without talking about anything that was actually wrong, which was, in its own way, but the most comforting thing anyone had done for her in months. Before she left, Silas held her face in his hands for a moment, the way he'd done since she was a little girl. This specific gesture that meant, "I see you, I'm here," and said quietly, "Whatever's coming, Carys, you're going to be fine. I promise you that." She drove home, thinking it was just a father being a father. It was not just a father being a father. Meanwhile, across town, in an office that Carys's skipped lunches had helped furnish, Gavin Aldridge was having what he would later describe to his colleagues as the breakthrough moment of his career. It had come in the form of a phone call from a company called Meridian Capital Partners, a firm Gavin had been trying to get a meeting with for 2 years. They were interested, the voice on the phone said, in discussing a partnership, a significant one. They'd been watching Aldridge Consulting's work, the voice said, and they were impressed with Gavin's instincts, his network, his particular ability to identify undervalued acquisition targets before the broader market caught on. Gavin had hung up the phone and sat very still for about 30 seconds, and then he'd done something he almost never did anymore. He laughed, loud and genuine, right there alone in his office, with the leather chair Carys had found at an estate sale and sanded down herself behind him, and the curtains she'd hemmed to fit the windows because buying custom ones was too expensive. He called a few colleagues. He called his golf buddy. He did not call Carys. In the weeks that followed, Gavin changed in ways that were subtle at first, and then absolutely not. He got a new suit. Not the one Carys had bought him, a better one, Italian wool, the kind where even the lining is beautiful. He started going to a different gym, one downtown with a juice bar and a rooftop. He stopped coming home for dinner, and then eventually, he stopped coming home, much at all, citing late meetings and early calls with investors. And when Carys tried to ask about the company, about Meridian, about what exactly was happening, he would give her a version of an answer that explained nothing and somehow still made her feel like she'd asked something stupid. "You wouldn't understand the structure of it," he said once, not unkindly, which was almost worse than if he'd said it meanly. She was working a Tuesday night shift. He's standing over a sink full of dishes because one of the other servers had called in sick and the dishwasher had gone home early, when she realized she couldn't remember the last time Gavin had looked at her, really looked at her. Not at the apartment, not at the bills on the counter, not at his phone while she was talking. At her. She stood there with her hands in the hot water, and she thought, oh, not with anger, with the particular grief of finally seeing something clearly that you'd been half seeing for a long time. Gavin was so busy looking at the stars that he didn't realize the ground he was standing on was about to be pulled out from under him. He asked her to come to the office on a Thursday afternoon. That alone was unusual. Gavin had never been in the habit of inviting Carys to the office in any real sense. She'd stopped by once or twice early on, when the place was still a shared workspace with second-hand furniture and a temperamental coffee maker, but as the business grew and the furniture improved and the address got better, those invitations stopped coming. The office had become, in a very quiet but deliberate way, a space that was his and not hers, and they'd both accepted that without ever actually agreeing to it. So when he texted, "Can you come by at 3?" I need to talk to you about something. She'd had to read it twice. Her first thought, God help her, was hope. The optimistic, exhausted kind. Maybe he'd finally seen what she couldn't quite articulate, that they were disappearing from each other, and that they needed something to change before there was nothing left to save. She took her break early, washed the smell of the diner off her hands as best she could in the bathroom sink, and drove over in the coat she'd bought at the Goodwill on 5th, the one with the slightly worn right elbow and the buttons that didn't quite match. The office building was glass and steel, and it smelled like nothing. That's what struck her first, walking through the lobby. The complete absence of smell. Filtered air, perfectly neutral. The olfactory equivalent of a blank page. Everything was deliberate and clean and curated. From the abstract art on the walls to the receptionist's minimal jewelry to the way the light fell in long, even rectangles across the marble floor. Gavin's office was on the 7th floor. His assistant, a young woman Carys had never met, who looked at her with an expression that lasted only a quarter of a second, but contained somehow a complete assessment, led her through and closed the door quietly behind her. The mahogany desk was new. She hadn't seen it before. It was enormous and completely clear except for a leather desk pad, and centered upon it a manila folder. Gavin was standing by the window when she came in. He turned and looked at her in a way she'd been preparing herself for without knowing it, and she understood immediately that this was not about saving anything. "Carys," he said, and then nothing for a moment. "Just say it," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that later. He moved to the desk with the particular kind of deliberateness that men use when they've rehearsed something. He opened the folder and slid it across to her, and she looked down at the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." And the room didn't spin, exactly, but it did something, like when you're standing in shallow water and a wave passes under you. Just enough shift to make your body recalibrate its understanding of solid ground. "I've had my attorney draw it up," he said. "It's equitable. You keep the furniture. I take the apartment lease since you're rarely there anyway." "Rarely there." She repeated the words, not as a question, but as a fact she was trying to hold in her mouth and understand. "You know what I mean." "Gavin." She looked up at him. "I work 14-hour days at that diner. I come home at midnight. I'm not rarely there. I'm exhausted there. There's a difference." He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable for about 2 seconds, and then the mask of the businessman slid back into place. "This isn't about fault," he said. "I'm not here to litigate the marriage. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and the direction my life is going. The company, Meridian, the opportunities that are opening up. I need to be in a different space. Personally," he paused, "I've outgrown this life, Carys, and honestly, I've outgrown you." She would think about that sentence for a long time afterward, not with bitterness in the end, but with a kind of anthropological interest in what it revealed about him. The complete, total failure of imagination required to look at another person and see only a stage you've moved on from, rather than a human being who handed you years of her life with both hands. "You haven't asked," she said quietly. "Asked what?" "How I am. You haven't asked how I'm doing. I drove here from a diner where I've been on my feet since 6 this morning, and you haven't once—" She stopped. She took a breath. "Never mind. Carys, I'm trying to do this respectfully." "Are you?" She looked at the divorce papers and then back at him, and something in her face must have shifted because for just a moment she saw something flicker in his. Not guilt, not quite, but maybe the ghost of it. Because respect might have looked like this conversation 6 months ago, Gavin. Before I skip another meal so your rent gets paid. Before the lease goes up for renewal. Before you'd already decided. He straightened his cuffs. The Italian wool suit moved perfectly when he did it. She remembered the day she'd handed over her savings for it. The way she'd told herself it was an investment in both of them. "The settlement is fair," he said. "You'll be fine." There it was. You'll be fine. The sentence people use when they want to end a conversation they never should have started this way in the first place. She picked up the pen. She could have made this harder. She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Thought about attorneys and contested proceedings and the legal argument that could be made about her financial contributions to the company in its early years, the informal kind that doesn't come with paperwork, the kind where you work yourself thin so someone else can build their dream. There was a case there, maybe a good one, but something in her was too tired for the fight, and something else, something quieter and more instinctive, told her to let it happen. Let him think he was the one with all the cards. Let him walk away with his folder and his Italian suit and his Meridian Capital deal and his sterile office that smelled like nothing. She signed her name, Carys Thorne, as it happened. She used the name on her ID, which was still her maiden name because she'd never quite gotten around to the paperwork. She hadn't planned it, but when Gavin noticed and frowned slightly at it, something in her almost smiled. "You'll receive a copy from my attorney," he said. She stood up. She was still wearing the coat with the worn elbow and the mismatched buttons, and she gathered herself into it with the quiet dignity of someone who has survived many things and knows it. "Good luck with Meridian," she said, and she meant it. Not warmly, not coldly. She said it the way you'd wish a stranger well who is about to make a very serious mistake they don't know about yet. She walked out through the filtered air and the neutral smell and the lobby with its perfect rectangles of light, and she sat in her car for 4 minutes before driving. Not home, but east, across town, to a shop with a hand-painted wooden sign. The ink on those papers was the last thing Gavin would ever truly own, though he didn't know it yet. The bell above the door made its single, soft note. Silas was at the bench, as always, working under the bright lamp with his loop and his tools in their velvet-lined tray. He looked up when she came in, and he read her the way he always did. And this time, he didn't hand her a clock to work on. He just stood up and opened his arms, and Carys walked into them the way she'd done as a small girl after bad days, and she didn't cry, exactly, but she held on with the particular fierceness of someone who has been holding themselves together for a very long time and has finally found a place where that's not required. "It's done," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said. She pulled back and looked at him. "You knew." "I've known it was coming for a while, yes." He guided her to the stool at the bench and put the kettle on the small hot plate he kept in the back. "I want to tell you something, Carys. Something I probably should have told you a long time ago, but I was—" He paused, choosing his words with the same care he used for everything. "I was waiting to understand something first." "Waiting to understand what?" "Gavin." He said the name flatly, without heat. Who he was, what he was made of. "Dad," she watched him. "What are you saying?" Silas Thorne set 2 mugs on the workbench and settled onto his stool, and he folded his hands in that deliberate way of his, and he looked at his daughter with an expression she'd seen once or twice in her life. On the day she graduated, on the day she got married, the look of a man who has been carrying something important and has finally arrived at the moment to set it down. "You've always thought we were modest people," he said, "because of the shop, the truck, the apartment. We are modest people. Carys," he said her name gently. "The shop is a hobby. The truck is because I like that truck. The apartment is because," he almost smiled, "because I sleep there and it suits me fine." She stared at him. "I am going to tell you some numbers," he said, "and I need you to stay with me while I tell them, because your first instinct is going to be to think I'm confused." She stayed with him. The numbers he told her were not modest. The numbers he told her, spoken in that same unhurried, matter-of-fact tone he used to explain how a gear train worked, were the kind of numbers that existed in a category of wealth that Carys had no personal frame of reference for. The kind of wealth that doesn't have a house with a price tag because it owns the buildings those houses are in. The kind of wealth that doesn't deal with financial advisors because it is the financial institution. Silas Thorne was conservatively worth more than $3 trillion. The money was built over 40 years through a holding company called Thorne Global, which owned stakes in infrastructure, technology, energy, and real estate across 11 countries. The holding company was structured through a series of subsidiary entities with deliberately undistinguished names, none of which bore any obvious connection to a watchmaker on the east side of a mid-sized American city. That was by design. Everything about Silas Thorne's public life was by design. Carys sat with this for a long moment. "Why?" she said finally. The question was simple, but it contained about 40 more questions inside it. Silas wrapped his hands around his mug. "When your mother died, I made a decision. She was the most genuine person I ever met, and she chose me when I had nothing, before any of this. And she worried constantly toward the end about what the money might do, to you specifically, to your ability to understand the world as it actually is, to build your own character without," he paused, "without a net that makes you never learn to fall well. So you hid it from me. I let you live in the real world," he said, and his voice was careful with the distinction. "You learned how to work. You learned how to sacrifice. You learned that things break, and that broken things can be fixed, and that some broken things should be left behind. That last one took a little longer." He looked at her steadily. "You've been learning it for the last 5 years." She thought about the diner, the dishwater, the coat, the skipped meals. "I would have liked to know," she said. There was no anger in it, just honesty. "I know," he nodded. "And if you'd come to me in genuine crisis, real danger, Carys, hunger, or illness, or something that could harm you, I would have told you that day. But you were never in genuine danger. You were just in difficulty. And difficulty—" He looked at his workbench, at the tools and the movements, and the decades of restored mechanisms. "Difficulty is the thing that makes people interesting." She looked at him for a very long time. "Gavin's company," she said slowly. "Aldridge Consulting." Silas tilted his head in the way that meant yes, keep going. "Meridian Capital Partners," she said. Her voice had changed slightly. "The firm that contacted him, the one that's been funding his expansion." "A subsidiary of Thorne Global," Silas said simply. 3 layers removed, untraceable, without specific forensic knowledge. She stood up from the stool. She walked 3 paces and then turned around. "You funded his company." "I facilitated a test," Silas said. "There's a difference." "Tell me the difference." He stood too, because this felt like a standing-up conversation. 3 years ago, when Gavin's business was still genuinely struggling, Meridian Capital approached him. Real capital, real operational support, but structured so that the investors remained anonymous, and so that Gavin reported, ultimately, though he didn't know it, to a board of my choosing. I wanted to watch what a man did with opportunity. When the risk was removed, and the money was real, and the path was clear, what kind of person did he become? She already knew the answer. She'd lived it. He left you, Silas said quietly. When the opportunity materialized, and his first instinct was to shed everything that reminded him of the person he used to be, including his wife, including the woman who built the floor he was standing on. He paused. That told me everything I needed to know about Gavin Aldridge. So what happens now? She asked. To his company? The quarterly acquisition cycle closes in 2 weeks, Silas said. Meridian will complete its purchase of the remaining shares of Aldridge Consulting. Full ownership transfer. At which point the company, and by extension Gavin, will report to Thorne Global directly. Report to you. Report to me. He picked up his mug. And to you, if you're interested. She stood in the middle of the shop, with the clocks ticking around her on every wall, each one keeping its own particular kind of time, and she breathed. She thought about 5 years. She thought about dishwater and thrift store coats, and the night she stayed up until 3 a.m. hemming curtains for his office windows. She thought about the way he'd said, "I've outgrown you," with such complete, casual certainty, as if a person was something you moved past like a toll booth on the road to somewhere better. "I'm interested," she said. And Silas Thorne, who had spent 40 years building the most quietly powerful private fortune in the Western Hemisphere, who had eaten discount grocery store pasta and driven his old truck and wound his clocks every Sunday evening and never once needed anyone to know how significant he was, smiled at his daughter with every atom of pride he possessed. "Good," he said, "then let's get you up to speed." What happened next was, in its way, as precise and careful as the repair of a complicated mechanism. Silas introduced Carys to the world she'd been adjacent to all her life without knowing it. Gradually, methodically, without theater. She met the lawyers who managed Thorne Global's holdings. She met the quiet, brilliant woman named Drea, who served as Silas's chief operating officer and who had, Carys realized, been watching Carys for years, the way you watch someone you're eventually going to hand something important to. She sat in on board calls and walked through financial models and absorbed information with the same focused, practical intelligence she'd brought to every broken watch her father had ever handed her. She also slept for 12 hours straight on the second day, and the third. She resigned from the Copper Spoon on a Tuesday, thanked the manager, tipped out her remaining float to the other servers, and washed her hands at the diner sink for the last time. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, with the water running over her reddened hands, because she wanted to remember it, not with regret, but with the particular respect you owe to a hard thing you came through. She bought exactly one new outfit for what was coming. One suit, well-made, but not flashy. She chose it herself. Gavin, meanwhile, was in the middle of the best month of his professional life. The Meridian deal was accelerating beautifully. The firm had indicated they were ready to formalize the acquisition structure, which Gavin understood to mean that Aldridge Consulting would become the flagship advisory arm of a much larger entity, with Gavin retained as CEO at a compensation package that made him feel, for the first time, like the version of himself he'd always been certain was in there somewhere. He'd put an offer on a penthouse apartment. He was in negotiations for a new car, something European, something that announced itself before you saw it clearly. He signed the divorce finalization papers when they came through from his attorney, barely read them, handed them back without sentiment. He told his golf buddy over drinks that the marriage had been holding him back, that Carys was a good person, but fundamentally not someone who could exist at the level he was reaching for. His golf buddy nodded and said something agreeable, and neither of them thought about her for another minute. The boardroom meeting was scheduled for a Thursday. Aldridge Consulting would formalize its position within the Meridian structure, and Gavin would sign the operational transfer documents that would cement his role. His attorney would be present, as would two of his senior partners, and the Meridian representatives, including, the email had mentioned, the principal investor who had until now remained anonymous. Gavin had read that detail with excitement. He liked the idea of finally meeting the money. He liked the idea of looking across a table at someone who had believed in him enough to fund his ascent and saying, simply by his presence and his Italian suit and his accomplished handshake, that the belief had been well placed. Gavin thought he was the hunter. He was, in fact, the one who had just walked into the most expensive trap in history. The building that housed the Thorne Global Executive Offices was not the flashiest building in the city's financial district. It was deliberate about this. The lobby was clean and high-ceilinged and made of materials that were expensive in the way that things are expensive when they don't need to tell you they're expensive. No marble waterfall feature, no massive logo, just well-proportioned space and good light, and a reception desk staffed by a woman who looked like she had never been surprised by anything. Gavin walked in with his two senior partners, his attorney, and the pleasantly elevated confidence of a man who believes he is about to be given something. The elevator opened onto the executive floor, which was carpeted in a deep charcoal gray and lined on one side with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city in a way that made everything below look very small. A quiet assistant led them to the boardroom, offered water, and withdrew. The room was set up around a long table. Not mahogany, Gavin noticed, but something darker and older, with the kind of surface grain that comes from wood that's genuinely 100 years old. 8 chairs on each side and one at the head. The chairs were filled by people Gavin didn't recognize, men and women in various states of well-tailored calm, most of them with tablets or notepads, all of them with the particular quality of attention that comes from people who spend their time in very high-stakes rooms and have made peace with it. At the head of the table was an older man with silver hair and reading glasses at the end of his nose and the hands of someone who had spent decades doing precise, careful work. Gavin looked at him for 3 full seconds before anything connected. The watch shop, the hand-painted sign, the Saturday mornings that Carys used to mention, the ones he'd never asked about with any genuine interest. The father she spoke of with a warmth he'd always found faintly sentimental. He was still working out the geometry of it, still feeling the first cold edge of what this might mean, when the door on the far side of the room opened. Carys walked in. Not the Carys of the diner, in the thrift store coat with the worn elbow. Not the Carys who slid into the chair across his mahogany desk with red hands and exhausted eyes. This was the same woman. The same posture, the same steady quality of gaze, the same particular set to her jaw that she'd always had and he'd always underestimated, but assembled differently, like a movement that's been cleaned and calibrated and wound by someone who knows exactly what it can do. She carried a single folder. She took a chair to the right of Silas, which placed her directly across the table from Gavin, and she set the folder down and folded her hands and looked at him the way you look at something you've examined completely and have no remaining confusion about. "Gavin," she said, "thanks for coming." He opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out. It was Silas who spoke first, in the same unhurried, matter-of-fact tone he used for everything. "Mr. Aldridge, I'm Silas Thorne. I'm the principal investor behind Meridian Capital Partners, and I'm the chairman of Thorne Global, which has completed its acquisition of Aldridge Consulting as of this morning." He paused to let that settle. "You and I haven't met formally, though I believe you've benefited from my capital for approximately 3 years. Gavin looked at his attorney. His attorney was reading something on a tablet with the expression of a man very carefully not making eye contact. "This is a—" Gavin stopped, restarted. "I think there's some confusion about the structure of the acquisition." "There isn't," Silas said pleasantly. He nodded to someone at the end of the table, who slid a packet of documents toward Gavin. "The terms are outlined in full. Aldridge Consulting is now a wholly owned advisory subsidiary of Thorne Global. Your retainer as an operational consultant is outlined in Section 4, though I want to be transparent that we've restructured the executive leadership of the subsidiary. The new director of Aldridge Consulting's advisory division will be introduced this morning." Gavin looked at Carys. Carys opened her folder. "That would be me," she said. Not triumphantly, not coldly, just simply the way you state a fact about a mechanism that is working the way it was designed to work. "Effective today, I'm the director of the advisory division. I'll be your operational supervisor for any work you continue in a consulting capacity." The silence in the room was the kind that has texture to it. Gavin's face moved through several stations. Shock first, the raw, physical kind that reorganizes your features before you've had time to manage them. Well, then, something close to disbelief, the mental scrambling of a person trying to find the version of this that makes more sense. Then, as the scrambling failed, a flicker of something that might have been shame, though it was hard to tell because Gavin had always been very good at converting shame into anger before it fully formed. "Carys," he said. His voice had dropped. "What is this?" "This is a board meeting," she said. "You know what I mean." She did know. She took a breath, and she thought, very briefly, about the things she could say here. She could list the years. She could itemize the meals she didn't eat, and the shifts she worked, and the coat, and the furniture, and the curtains, and the way he'd looked at her across that mahogany desk like she was something he was done with. And she could construct a case so thorough and so specific that there would be no angle from which he could look at the next 60 seconds and feel good about himself. She decided not to. Not out of mercy exactly, more because she'd realized somewhere in the last few weeks that she wasn't doing this to Gavin. She was doing it from herself. There was a difference, and the difference mattered, and she wasn't going to let him make it about him, even in her own mind. "You're welcome to review the acquisition terms with your attorney," she said. "The consulting arrangement is genuinely fair. Scope is laid out in Section 4, compensation in Section 5. You're good at what you do, Gavin. The firm is interested in retaining that in a structured capacity." She paused. "But the firm is mine now, and that's just how it is." He looked at Silas. Silas was drinking from a small water glass with the unhurried patience of a man who has been waiting for this particular moment for 3 years and finds, now that it's arrived, that it is exactly as satisfying as he expected. "You used me," Gavin said to him. The anger was arriving now, sharpening the edges of his voice. "You funded me to—" "What? To test me? That's—" "I gave you exactly what you said you needed," Silas said. "Capital, opportunity, a clear path. What you did with it tells me everything I needed to know." He set down his glass. "You left my daughter." The room was very quiet. "I left her because we'd grown apart." "You left her," Silas said, with the quiet finality of someone closing a watch case. 3 days after the Meridian capital transferred, and your financial pressure was removed. You'd already consulted with a divorce attorney before the ink on the Meridian term sheet was dry. He looked at Gavin, over the rim of his glasses, in the way he might look at a movement that had failed not from complexity, but from something simpler and more fundamental. "I'm not angry with you, Mr. Aldridge. I'm just clear about who you are. That's all." Gavin sat with that. There was nowhere to go with it. His attorney was still reading his tablet. His senior partners were looking at the table. The rest of the room was watching with the careful neutrality of people who have seen this kind of thing before and know that the best thing to do is hold steady and let it finish. Carys looked at her ex-husband, and he was her ex-husband now. That was simply the word that applied. And she saw him as he actually was. Not the man from the fire escape with the wild light in his eyes and the electric hunger. Not the cold executive across the mahogany desk. Just a person who had been given something and hadn't known what to do with it, and had made choices that said more about him than he would ever want them to say, and who was now sitting in the evidence of those choices with nowhere to redirect the gaze. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt sorry for him. Not in the way that diminishes you, not the pitying kind that makes you feel superior, but the plain, human kind. The kind that comes from recognizing that some people build their entire architecture on the wrong foundation and don't discover it until the whole thing reveals its flaw at the worst possible moment. She felt sorry for him, and she was done with him, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither one cancelled the other out. "The documents are in front of you," she said gently. "Take the time you need." She turned to Silas, and Silas gave her the smallest nod, the one that meant well done, "I love you, I'm proud." And she turned back to the room and started the meeting, because there was a great deal of work ahead of her, and she was, above everything, a person who did not leave work unfinished. The weeks after the boardroom were quieter than you might expect. There was no public drama, no press release, no social media moment, no satisfying viral clip. Silas would not have allowed it, and Carys did not want it. The story of what happened in that room stayed in that room, and carried by the people who'd been present as a private piece of knowledge that settled into the bones of the company's new culture quietly and permanently. Gavin signed the consulting arrangement after 2 days of his attorney reviewing it. The terms were fair. Carys had insisted on that specifically, not for Gavin's sake, but for her own. She didn't want to punish him. She wanted to be different from him. He stayed on in a restructured capacity, showed up for the meeting she scheduled, and was professional in a way that had the slightly stiff quality of someone performing a version of themselves they'd never practiced. She was professional back. It worked, in the way that things work when both people have decided to be adults about something that required a great deal of growing up to get through. She moved out of the apartment and into a place of her own. Not a penthouse, not yet, though she could have. A clean apartment with windows that got good morning light and a kitchen she actually cooked in. She bought plants, the kind you have to pay attention to, and kept them alive. She slept 8 hours a night, like it was a discipline. She still went to the shop on Saturday mornings. She still sat at the bench next to her father, and he still handed her complicated things and asked her to tell him what was wrong, and she still worked through it with her hands in that particular quiet that exists between people who really know each other. Only now, after they'd been working for an hour or two, she'd put something down and ask about Indonesia or the infrastructure deal in the north, unto what he thought about the timing on the energy sector acquisition, and he'd answer with the same unhurried precision he used for everything, and they'd talk about the world they were building together while the clocks on the walls kept time around them. One Saturday, she found a small carriage clock on the bench. Similar to the one she'd worked on the week before, Gavin handed her the divorce papers. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. "What's wrong with this one?" she asked. Silas looked up over his glasses. His eyes were warm. "Nothing," he said. "It works perfectly. I just wanted you to hold something that isn't broken." She turned the clock over in her hands and listened to it tick, steady and sure, measuring out the ordinary miracle of time just passing. Not backward, not forward in the anxious way, just passing. And she thought about how long she'd been moving through her life with the particular urgent crouch of someone bracing for the next thing to go wrong, and how strange it felt, and how good to simply stand upright in a moment that didn't require anything from her except her presence in it. The clock ticked. She was still young. She had her father's hands and her mother's ability to love without condition, and 5 years of learning that she was capable of more than she'd been given credit for, which is the most useful thing a person can know about themselves. She set the clock down gently. "Okay," she said. "What's next?" And Silas Thorne, trillionaire, clockmaker, father, smiled and handed her something complicated. That was a journey. What was the moment for you? Was it when Carys finally saw Gavin for who he was? Or the look on his face in that boardroom? Let me know below. Like and subscribe if you think Carys made the right choice. Thanks for watching.